My family has always been a little weird. My grandparents used to live on a farm in the middle of Arkansas. They had all the things you'd expect to find on a farm. Chickens, cows, sheep. My family has always been quite large too. For some reason my grandparents found it a good idea to have 8 children. I'm not sure what they were thinking. I couldn't imagine having that many kids to watch over. 5 boys and 3 girls. My uncles had all been born consecutively, with 2 younger sisters and 1 older sister, my mother. Raising boys must be tiring. I've heard all the stories from my mother. Once, my Uncle Tom got his arm run over by a bicycle, thanks to my Uncle Rich. Another time, the 5 brothers had jumped off a cliff into a nearby lake, and not one of them had returned home without some kind of injury. My uncles had always been crazy. Growing up, I got to see my family a lot. We'd held family gatherings on the farm every year, up until my grandparents passed away, that is. We would drive to the farm on a Monday and head home on a Friday. It was the only time of the year where I would see all of my cousins at the same time, and boy, were there a lot of us. My Uncle Rich was always the fun one. He'd bring all of us kids fun new board games to play every time we saw him. I loved them all the same though. Even my Uncle Chuck. He was the oldest of the brothers, yet had never married for whatever reason. He'd always seemed to ignore my sister and me. My parents had decided to have 2 children of their own, me, of course, and my older sister, Emily. We were very close growing up, having been born within just a few years of one another, but life had pulled us apart. Emily moved away to Ohio and started a family for herself, almost 8 years ago now. I've seen her only 3 times since. That's why I jumped on the idea of holding another family gathering when my mother presented it to me. My parents live close to the farm, and I live just outside of Little Rock, but everyone else has long since moved away. All of my extended family showed great interest in holding another family get-together. We hadn't had one since my grandparents had passed away. The date was set for this weekend. I met my parents at the farm last week with my boyfriend Jason. The farm needed a bit of a clean-up, but my parents had been regularly checking on the place since the land had been passed on to the children. My Uncle Rich and Aunt May arrived first. I hadn't seen them in so long, but they looked exactly the same to me. My cousin Robert had grown though. He was almost a man now. It was bizarre to see him in real life as opposed to through my computer screen. I chatted with him for a while, catching up. We hadn't talked since we saw each other last, and that was nearly half a decade ago. "You got so tall," I said, laughing. Robert smiled. "You definitely got taller too," he replied. "I always used to think I'd never be taller than you." I laughed again. "I'm glad you did. You don't see many girls above 6'2". Robert chuckled, looking towards the front door. My mother pulled it open, yelling out in happiness as her sister, my Aunt Deb, stepped inside. I smiled politely at my aunt as she stepped inside, giving her a hug and answering her generic questions as she spoke. I was mainly just killing the time until the person I cared about the most had arrived. "Yeah, I'm 22 now," I said, smiling. "God, they really do grow up fast," my Aunt Deb said, holding her hand by her waist, her palm pointed downwards. "I remember when you only came up to here." I laughed politely, looking towards the open front door. A car had pulled up into the driveway. "I'm going to go and see who just got here," I said, getting away from the conversation as quickly as I could. I had never seen the car before now, but it wasn't hard to recognize my sister in the front seat. Emily barely had time to step out of her car before I was there, my arms wrapped around her. "Emily," I said, not knowing what to say. "God, it's been so long." "It's been too long, Bella," she replied, stepping back. "Look at you! You're as old as I was when we last saw each other." "We can't do this again," I said, looking over at the man who stepped out of the passenger seat. "It's nice to see you again, Henry." Emily's husband gave me a brief hug. "Same to you," he said, opening the backseat door. "Come on, bud. We gotta go talk to some family." "You want to do that for me?" The boy in the back seat didn't respond. He continued to stare at his handheld video game console, silent. Henry unbuckled Mason's seatbelt, the boy finally stepping out of the car. "Hey, Mason," I said, kneeling down in front of the boy. "It's been a long time." Mason didn't reply. his fingers pressed away at the buttons on his game. Mason's autistic. Since he'd been born, I'd only ever heard him speak a few times. His early years must have been tough for Emily. I imagine it was part of the reason we split apart. I wish she'd have come to me back then. I would have been more than happy to help. I still would be. I stood back up, looking backwards towards my sister. Be warned, Aunt Deb is inside. My sister rolled her eyes, smiling. It's a good thing we're here for a week. I don't think Deb would have enough time to talk otherwise. The rest of my family arrived throughout the day. All of my uncles, aunts and cousins were in the house by 9 o'clock that night. It was a really cool thing to see. Maybe this could become the new family tradition if I was lucky. I stood in the kitchen later that night with Emily, who had volunteered to help clean the dishes with me. My parents, aunts and uncles sat outside, catching up while all of the kids played together out in the field. I looked over my shoulder, eyeing Mason as he played on his handheld game. Don't you want to go play outside with the other kids, Mason? I asked, glancing at my sister. Mason didn't look up from his game. Ava, he said, tapping furiously on the device. I froze. Did he just... I trailed off. Oh, that, Emily said, laughing to herself. He's been saying that for almost a year now. We're not really sure why. Really? I asked, watching the boy as he played. Yeah, she said, sighing. It's about all he'll say. I nodded slowly. Hey, Mason. Who is Ava? Ava, the boy said, the screen flashing light across his face. We don't know any Avas, Emily said, looking at me. There's no one in his class named Ava either. His doctor thinks it means nothing. Maybe he heard the name on the TV, I said, drying the plate that Emily had just handed me. Yeah, maybe, she said. I'm glad he says it though. It's the only time I get to hear his voice. I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness. It really must be tough, Em. She sighed once more. You could say that, yeah. Hey, I said, leaning against the counter. I know we live super far apart now and everything, but I'm always here for you, okay? If you ever need anything from me, just call. Emily smiled at me. Thanks, Bella. I don't really know why we stopped talking. I regret it. I think about it a lot. Well, let's change that, I said, starting now. I'd love to be back in your life again. In all of your lives, I added, gesturing towards Mason. Emily hummed in agreement. I'm sure Mason would like that too. He may not show it, but I'm sure seeing you all means everything to him. Ava, Mason said, drawing my attention. Well, I'm going to see if anyone needs anything outside, Emily said, opening the back door. Do you have the dishes handled? You got it, I said, smirking as my sister shut the door. Ava, Mason said. Ava must be a pretty cool chick, I said, scrubbing the food off of the closest plate. Yes. I frowned, looking back at Mason. His eyes were glued to the device. She's cool then, I asked, leaning against the counter. I love you, Auntie Bella, Mason said, an electronic explosion coming from his game. I froze, completely shocked. Oh, wow. I love you too, buddy. Ava, Mason mumbled, his eyes unmoving. I stared at Mason for a little while. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I couldn't wait to tell Emily. I returned to cleaning the dishes. As I cleaned, I couldn't help but continue thinking about what had just happened. Could I get any more out of him? Hey, Mason, I asked, scrubbing leftover food from another plate. Ava, Mason replied. Can you tell me more about this Ava person? I said, setting the plate down on the counter. Do you want to see what I can do? Mason asked. I looked over my shoulder. Mason had set down his game. He stared directly at me now. It was the first time I'd seen him look directly at anyone. I stammered, unsure of what to say. Yeah, sure, I'd love to, I said, walking up to the couch in the living room. I rested my hands on the back of it, watching my nephew. Mason looked away from me, his eyes facing the wall. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. Mason began to lean slowly backwards. Don't fall over, buddy, I said, watching as Mason moved backwards. I frowned, noticing that the boy was now past the halfway point of being completely parallel with the floor. Mason? I asked, stepping around the couch. The boy returned to a straight standing position with ease. He turned to look at me, a blank look in his eyes. I stared at my nephew for a few moments before clapping. "Wow, good job, Mason." "AVA," Mason said, sitting back on the floor and picking up his game. I stood silently for a while, watching him play it. That really had been impressive. If I tried doing the same, I'd have fallen straight onto my back. I finished washing the dishes as Emily came back inside. She cried when I told her about what Mason had said to me. She didn't know what I'd meant when I mentioned his leaning trick. The next day I decided to spend some more time around Mason. Emily wanted to see what I'd been talking about, and I intended to show her. Just after lunch, my youngest cousin, Natalie, decided to sit down with Mason and I. "How's middle school, Nat?" I asked, sitting on the floor with my legs spread out. "It's okay, I guess," she said, shrugging. "It's really hard, though." I nodded, smiling. If only she knew. "Any boys?" I asked, causing her to giggle. "Stop it," she said, blushing. "That sounds like a yes to me," I said, pointing playfully towards her. I felt an odd tickling sensation on the bottom of my foot. I pulled my legs up underneath me. "I'm not going to talk about this with you," she said, clearly wanting to talk about it. I laughed. "Whatever you say," I said, looking over at Emily. She was speaking to our mother. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see my boyfriend. No one was there. I gasped, scooting away from the chair. Natalie stared at me with wide eyes. "What? What was that?" I asked, pushing myself to my feet. "AVA," Mason said, seemingly startled by all the commotion. His eyes remained on his game. "What was that?" Natalie asked, confused. "What's wrong, Isabella?" my mother asked from behind me, a look of worry on her face. It's nothing," I said, shaking my head. "Are you sure?" Emily said. "You look pretty spooked." I nodded. "I'm going to just get some fresh air, I think." My mother nodded cautiously as I walked towards the back of the house, stepping out into the backyard. My father stood nearby, talking to my uncles, Steve and Rich. My Uncle Chuck was out in the lawn, talking to my younger cousins, Alan and Zeke. I found my cousin Beth swinging by herself on the old swing set my grandfather had built for us many years ago. I sat with her for a while, talking about how life had been recently. It was crazy having so many family members, yet having no idea about the small details of their lives. It was kind of sad, really. Dinner that night was pretty uneventful. My eyes remained on Mason the entire time, who moved away from his game only to take in a mouthful of mashed potatoes. By 11, my family had almost entirely gone to sleep. Emily had put Mason to bed up in his bedroom and now sat on the living room couch with her husband. The two were watching TV with our Uncle Tom and Aunt Lisa. I yawned, heading to bed. I was staying in one of the many spare bedrooms with Jason. I found my boyfriend already in bed. "Hey, Jay," I said, closing the door behind me. "Hey, Bella," Jason said, looking up from his phone as I stepped into the room. "When did you come to bed?" I asked, undressing. "About 10 minutes ago," he said, returning his eyes to his phone. "I suddenly got unbelievably tired when talking to your Uncle Steve." I laughed, putting on my pyjamas. "They're not all that bad, Jay." Jason nodded. "Yeah, but I only have so much conversation in me, babe," he said, setting down his phone. "I have to recharge, you know." I nodded, smiling. I get it, I said, giving him a kiss and getting under the covers. "You better get to sleep then. Don't want to waste precious charging time." Jason sighed, smirking as he shut off the lamp by his head. I slept peacefully, for a few hours at least. I woke up around 1:30 in the morning. I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. It was hard to tell, but the bedroom door seemed to be open. Had Jason gone to the bathroom and forgot to shut it when he came back? The doorway was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing there watching me. I looked over to Jason, who was fast asleep. I groaned softly, getting out from under the covers. I moved to the doorway, looking out into the hallway. I looked to either side, discovering that the hallway was empty. I grabbed the doorknob, ready to shut the door and return to bed, when I swore I could feel a hand brush my own. I gasped lightly, yanking my hand away from the door. I stepped back out into the hallway, confused. The lamp at the end of the hallway flickered on for a moment before shutting off again. I froze, unsure of what was happening. Were the kids playing a trick on me? They were going to soon find out that they shouldn't mess with me after waking me up. I walked slowly down the hallway, turning the corner. The light near the back of the living room flashed on briefly in the same manner, before shutting off once more. I couldn't see who turned the light on. I walked out into the living room. Emily and her husband were fast asleep on the couch. My feet carried me to the lamp at the edge of the living room. A light flickered from the top of the staircase to my right. What was going on? I crept up the stairs, my heart beginning to beat faster. If one of these kids jumped out at me, I swore I'd kill them. At the top of the staircase, I was greeted with a long hallway full of doors. I wasn't sure where to go next. I moved down the hallway slowly, looking at each door as I moved. I didn't want to look inside in fear of waking anyone else up. A door slowly opened in front of me, completely silent. The hinges didn't creak, the handle didn't move. Nothing. I frowned, stepping up to the door and pushing it open, stepping into the dark room. The light suddenly flashed on. Mason was sat in his bed, his game console in his hands. At the foot of the bed stood my Uncle Chuck, staring at Mason in only his boxers. A slight bulge could be seen in the front. I froze, unsure of what I was looking at. Uncle Chuck turned to look at me, fear in his eyes. Mason's eyes remained glued to his game. "Uncle Chuck," I said, taking a step back. "What are you doing?" Chuck said, turning fully towards me. "What?" I started, trailing off. I was beginning to feel sick. "Don't you dare tell anyone about this," he said, pointing at me. I could feel a sudden anger growing inside of me. "What the fuck were you doing in here?" "You're making a mistake, Isabella," he said, stepping back towards Mason. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" I said, stepping back towards him. I was angry now. My uncle reached behind him and picked up an object from the desk. "I'll do it, don't think I won't," he said, holding the object to his wrist. I could tell now that it was a knife. For a moment I felt bad. Then I remembered what I'd just walked in on. "Do it. Do you think I fucking care?" I said. Chuck blinked, unsure of what to say. There was clearly something wrong with him. He looked over at Mason, who continued to play on his game. "That boy has always been screwy, hasn't he?" "Ava," Mason whispered, pushing the buttons on his device. "Poor thing," he said, stepping towards my nephew. "Why would they let him live like this anyway?" "Don't fucking touch him," I said, stepping towards my uncle. "Or what?" he said, grabbing Mason's arm. "I'm fucked now. I've got nothing left at this point." I held up my hands, taking a step back. "Now, just wait." Chuck suddenly lifted Mason, holding him against his chest. He held the knife up to Mason's throat. "It would be a mercy." "Chuck, stop it," I said, taking another step towards my uncle. "Take one more fucking step," he said, taking a step backwards. "See what happens." "What do you want from me?" I said, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "I don't know," he said, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. "If I let you both go, you'll certainly tell someone what you saw here." "I won't," I said, unable to convince even myself. "I promise. Just don't hurt Mason, please." "Now why should I believe that?" Chuck said, shaking his head. "I know you hate me. You always have. You and your stupid fucking sister." I shook my head, tears flowing down my cheeks. "We didn't. Uncle Chuck, I promise." "Your cousins are the only loves I've ever had," he said, quivering. "I think it's my time to go." I clasped my hands together, pleading. "Please let him go. I promise. I promise." Chuck stood, shifting on his feet while staring at me. "Ava," Mason said, looking directly at me. Chuck groaned, holding the blade harder against Mason's throat. "Ava," Mason repeated, closing his eyes. A loud snap filled my ears as Chuck's wrist was broken, the blade flying into the wall on the other side of the room. My uncle cried out in pain, holding his wrist as his hand hung limply from his arm. Mason fell back onto his bed, crawling up to his pillow. Chuck's eyes widened suddenly, his uninjured hand moving to his throat. Chuck looked as if he were being choked. I watched in horror as Chuck was lifted up off the ground, his body hovering several inches from the floor. Chuck was staring directly at me now, his eyes seemingly ready to pop out of his skull. An unbelievably wet crack echoed through the room as Chuck's neck was snapped. His head spun nearly a full rotation, the skin on his neck ripping as it did so. Chuck's lifeless corpse fell to the floor, blood beginning to flow from the wound and onto the wooden floor. "Thank you, Ava," Mason said, pulling himself back under the covers. I barely noticed my family as they crowded behind me, wondering what all the commotion was about. My eyes were locked on my nephew, who continued to play on his game as if nothing had happened. My family left earlier than expected. Surprisingly, most of my family wasn't shocked when I told them what I found Chuck doing. Everyone had had their suspicions, all for many tiny, differing reasons. They were more confused about what had happened to his head. I think they think I did it to him. The police certainly do. They didn't seem to care once they'd discovered that I was only protecting Mason. They cleaned up the scene and that was that. Emily just left for Ohio about an hour ago. She promised we would catch up again soon. She thanked me several times for taking care of Mason. She said that she owed me for saving his life. I did nothing, though. Emily has spent all these years fearing for her son's safety, but it seems like she has nothing to be worried about. Thank you, Ava.